been 2 years since Deltarune's second chapter released, and the fandom is in a bit of a content drought. This year's anniversary didn't exactly spoil us like the Spamton sweepstakes did, and at this rate it feels like even the most dedicated/deranged fans are kinda running out of stuff to talk about. However, there is one aspect of this game that I feel has honestly untapped potential when it comes to speculating on the future of Deltarune, and that's the relationship between Susie and Ralsei. These two are our beloved deuteragonists and very unsubtly opposites in every conceivable way, down to their color schemes, kind of. The conflict between them is a major part of Chapter 1's plot, and Chapter 2 emphasizes them getting closer, but it seems to me that their relationship and what it could mean for the story doesn't really get discussed. Which is strange, because while Chris is lovely, Ralsei and Susie have the added advantage of not being silent protagonists and thus exchanging readable dialogue. So talking about them is a tad more straightforward, if nothing else. Not only do I find their friendship more compelling than a lot of people give them credit for, but I think it's surprisingly relevant to Deltarune as a whole. Because of their heavily contrasted personalities and beliefs, they also offer different answers to many of the central questions that the game wants its players to think about, beyond just the pacifism versus violence issue of Chapter 1. For example, do our choices matter? Should we, the player, be given choices? Should more fountains be created? That is to say, is escapism a good thing? Is it okay that darkners exist entirely to serve lightners, or is that a little bit fucked up, actually? Should we even be following the prophecy? Why are they called Delta Warriors if there's 3 of them? For this reason, I want to analyze their relationship and its development over the course of the game, their differing views, and what those things mean for their characters and the plot of Deltarune going forward. While Ralsei acts as the guide of the party, Susie acts as just some guy who fell down here, and thus refuses to be guided by him. Naturally, their very first interaction is Ralsei telling Susie and Chris that they're heroes, and Susie going, yeah, no, try someone else. On paper, her rejection of this assigned role comes across as rebellious. But I'd argue her aggressive behavior in Chapter 1 is in part her conforming to the negative expectations of others. Susie's introduction presents her as a bully, just like all her classmates said she was. But dialogue from Chapter 1's hometown section reveals that even her more innocent actions are interpreted for the worse by the people around her. Her trying to join a game of handball is seen as threatening. She thinks that taking Jockington's hat once is what made her Caddy's enemy, and nobody's ever actually seen her beat anybody up, but she probably has, right? Even Noelle thinks the real Susie doesn't care about anybody at first. Her classmates' refusal to see her as anything but a bully only reinforces the idea that that's all she's capable of being, so she believes them and behaves like they expect her to. Naturally, she's not going to turn around and believe this generic hooded figure telling her she's a prophesized hero so easily. Contrastly, Ralsei's personality is cultivated to be as likable as possible and to conform to the idea of a perfect servant, guide, and friend. He's caught off guard by Susie's reaction, but optimistically accepts that they'll just have to reunite with her later and sort things out. When they do, he's clearly unhappy with her insistence on attacking enemies, but the best he can do is politely try to find a compromise, wanting to appear as friendly and agreeable as possible. After spending his entire life anticipating the arrival of these idealized pacifistic heroes, he's of course distraught that Susie isn't what he expected, but after ages of loneliness, he's also very intent on befriending her, and he doesn't want to be disliked no matter what. The thing with Ralsei is that he tries to enforce these ideals of how the story is supposed to go and the game is supposed to be played, but part of the way he acts out his perceived role is by being a massive doormat. Ralsei firmly believes that Darkners must fulfill their purpose of serving Lightners and making them happy. After all, they are personifications of objects. It's possible that him seeming to prioritize us, the player, over Chris and Susie is an extension of this, who are on an even higher level of reality than Lightners and can control timelines, among other things. So serving us and giving us choices is even more important. This belief results in some pretty uncomfortable behavior. Ralsei lacks the social experience to understand that friends should be equals and not have a master-servant relationship. He doesn't really object to his own mistreatment and has little sense of identity beyond fulfilling his purpose. As a result, he can have a pretty forgettable presence and is usually ignored by characters outside the party to the point where it's a running gag. One character who inexplicably doesn't ignore Ralsei, though, is Lancer. I love Lancer. Despite him clearly wanting to befriend Ralsei, however, Ralsei is just annoyed and confused by this behavior. Lancer isn't a Lightner or related to the prophecy, so Ralsei doesn't feel like they need to be friends. The opposite happens with Susie, though. Him thanking her for helping him when she's very much ready to bite his face off is probably the first time her actions have been interpreted for the better and not for the worse, even though she was actually trying to be intimidating. Although she doesn't get his Homestuck reference or why anyone would ever look up to her, hinting at her self-esteem issues, she does awkwardly praise his efforts, not knowing how to respond to someone who's actually being nice to her for once. During the second C-round battle, we learn more about why Susie fights enemies. She doesn't want to be seen as vulnerable, and claims C-round is unquestionably dangerous. I suspect others always assuming the worst of Susie has led her to in turn assume the worst of others and feel like they're all out to get her. She talks big about how she's on the verge of expulsion and everyone's waiting for it, but is she really? I mean, she and Chris disappear from school for a whole ass day and Alphys does nothing about it. I think she'll be fine. When Lancer calls the party heroes, Susie actually accepts the title this time and praises herself, but unfortunately this also happens to be Ralsei's breaking point. I think it's good for Ralsei that he's forced to actually speak his mind honestly and not be a people pleaser, but after meeting someone who admires her as she is, having that taken away and being told she's not doing it right inevitably upsets Susie. Ralsei admits that he may have been too hard on her and briefly brings up his fears of what will happen if Susie keeps fighting, but he doesn't specify exactly what he's afraid of, just brushes it off and decides she'll come around eventually if they're nice to her. He's not entirely wrong, but this is telling of a pattern with his character where he tries very, very hard not to dwell on anything negative. Susie and Lancer's shenanigans prove not to be particularly dangerous, though, so Ralsei's supportive of their friendship. The fact that he's so approving of it yet doesn't care to personally befriend Lancer demonstrates that his priorities lie exclusively in supporting the heroes over anything else. In fact, Susie and Lancer's relationship kind of seems to match Ralsei's ideal of redeeming the bad guys through the power of friendship, including the way they're defeated. However, something Ralsei will have to realize is that their bond on its own isn't going to prevent the conflict that will arise as they approach King's Castle. In fact, it escalates it. In the meantime, Ralsei offers to bake Susie a cake if she'll stop defaming his character, calling him a toothpaste boy. She does decline for now, but it's significant that Ralsei's even willing to tell her he doesn't like it in the first place, seeing as he tends to let other people walk all over him. On a related note, this is also where Ralsei introduces his belief I mentioned earlier about Darkners needing to assist Lightners to feel fulfilled. Susie is reasonably uncomfortable with this notion and says they should ditch the weird purpose talk because maybe Lancer just likes food, and Ralsei nudges her to admit that even she is maybe kinda sorta enjoying herself. Upon everyone waking up in the prison and Susie going off on her own, Ralsei kindly astral projects us into her point of view, which is something I have a lot to say about, as you can imagine, but we'll save that for later. And we learn that she can, in fact, solve basic puzzles on her own if needed. I'm not so sure she avoids doing them entirely out of laziness, though, because she did seem embarrassed to ask for Chris's help earlier, as though she genuinely thought she couldn't do it. Susie doesn't think very highly of herself in general, and we see that on full display when she confronts Lancer. Being deeply hurt to be betrayed by someone she thought she had a real connection with, Susie assumes the worst and takes it to mean he never really liked her in the first place. She doesn't let Lancer explain himself and says that she understands because nobody would want to be her friend anyway. At the same time, she's infuriated that he just stands in her way silently and doesn't fight back. Other people's silence allows Susie to project negativity onto them because she's so used to being treated that way. It's only when Lancer admits the truth that he didn't want them or his dad to get hurt that Susie considers pacifism. Ralsei certainly had a hand in giving her this idea, but despite this, it's Lancer's pain that really moves her to try it, and there's a reason for that. Ralsei didn't have a life before meeting the heroes, so he has these naive, idealistic views on heroism and solving everything through kindness that Susie can't possibly take seriously, because she has lived a life before this, and people haven't necessarily treated her kindly. Ralsei came from nothing in the most literal sense, and Susie came from something probably not very good. Scalding hot take here, but Susie probably has a bad home life if she has one at all. pretty much the first thing we learn about her is that she's the haha funny chalk eater, and it's far from the only non-standard thing she eats, something she has in common with Lancer, as well as their mutual love for bad guyisms and thrashing, and their role as outcasts that nobody likes. Lancer clearly has a rough relationship with his dad, why else would he reverse adopt this twink to be his second father figure, and given their parallels, it's hardly a stretch to say that Susie might too. As much as Lancer wants to be a bad guy though, he's ultimately very sweet and naive in a way that Susie, who very much can be kind but is guarded and pessimistic, isn't. In that aspect, he's more similar to Ralsei than to her, as both of them will soon make the same mistake in trying to reason with King. When Susie admits she'd like to try acting, Ralsei emphasizes that she won't have to figure things out by herself, and he's right to say this, because the Card Castle segment thoroughly demonstrates that neither he nor Susie have any game whatsoever. She does get to showcase her creativity though. Great teamwork, everyone. Susie also asks if Ralsei's cake offer is still on the table, and actually agrees to stop making fun of him this time. On paper, "I will bake you entire cakes if you stop calling me gay boy, please," sounds like a stupid deal, because it is. But again, Susie is likely food insecure, and Ralsei is someone who doesn't set boundaries like this and ask others to respect him. Through this deal, Susie becomes the sole exception to that rule, and you could similarly say that Ralsei is one of the first people Susie has chosen to respect in a long time, even if it is partially for cake. The central conflict of Chapter 1 that Susie and Ralsei are the main participants of is that between two extremes of fighting everyone or refusing to fight anyone, and throughout its plot the message seems to be leaning towards the latter. But King is the catalyst for all of the adversity that the characters have faced thus far, and yet in this pivotal battle, it doesn't matter what you do. There's no strategy, you can fight King or just survive, and it has no bearing on the following cutscene. Deltarune Chapter 1 has a mission to both maintain Undertale's message of pacifism, while also subverting it by saying that it isn't going to work 100% of the time, and it's going to show that narrative whether it's consistent with the way you played the game or not. It may be an overdone topic, but I really can't write a script about Susie and Ralsei without touching on the whole choices thing, seeing as they're the two characters who make directly contradicting statements about that within 10 minutes of each other. It's commonly accepted that Susie's line, "your choices don't matter," is the game's way of announcing that it's going to subvert Undertale. But what about Susie's in-universe reason for saying this? She does show a very pessimistic outlook in Chapter 1, so I think it may be that she feels like nothing she does matters and is projecting that onto Chris. But in the more literal context of the scene, this line is her telling Chris that they don't get to choose whether or not they'll do the project because she's gonna make them. That's strikingly similar to how we, the player, make choices for Chris. Deltarune further hammers in this theme by centering its plot around a prophecy. Ralsei says that although our journey has been foretold, the way we treat people does matter, and if we're not kind, we may not get a happy ending. Unlike what he believed, the only option for defeating King was through force. But whether or not you treated the rest of your enemies kindly does end up being the difference between a happy goodbye and a rude push to the exit. However, these changes are pretty superficial, especially because the Card Castle enemies in particular get recruited to Castletown either way. Still, I have to wonder if Susie and Ralsei were both correct in their statements on choices. After all, it's often theorized that while Susie speaks to Chris, Ralsei is often talking to us instead. And while Chapter 1 emphasizes the idea that our choices don't matter, Chapter 2 subverts this in more ways than one. The recruitment system is introduced, fighting Queen will result in Birdley's arm being injured, our lovingly designed thrash machine makes a return from its destruction, and what was that other thing? From the more in-universe perspective of the characters' choices mattering, I think the game gives us a resounding yes, they do matter. Susie recognizing that her actions have consequences and deciding to spare Lancer is a defining moment of her arc, as with Chris protecting Susie, and on the negative consequences side, Ralsei healing King. And okay, despite the twist of Chris exerting free will, the pie thing didn't really have any impact, but we've got a lot more coming in that regard. I've still got a bit more to say about Chapter 1, though. Remember when I said Susie and Ralsei's first interaction was Susie denying her role in the prophecy? I lied. Their very first interaction is Susie telling Ralsei to lose the hood because she can't hear him. And one of their last interactions in the chapter is Susie telling Ralsei to stop hiding his face in his hat because again, she can't hear him, encouraging him to reveal himself in a direct parallel to when they first met. This time, though, Ralsei took the first step. A major theme of this chapter is heroism and how heroes should act. Ralsei's opinion hasn't changed much, but how does Susie feel about her role as a hero now? She recognizes now that this dark world and fountain business is nothing to sneeze at, but doesn't necessarily see herself as an inherently important part of that. She words things like she and Chris just happened to end up involved by accident, they weren't fated to arrive or anything. The pacifism versus violence conflict is also one of many things Susie and Ralsei stand on different sides of, and in the end they both learn from one another and meet in the middle. Generally, the message leans towards pacifism, as that will get you the nicer ending, and also the message gets seriously undermined if you've been playing violently the whole time, but there's still the whole do our choices actually matter debacle, which, among other things, is a question that becomes even more relevant in Chapter 2. To my understanding, as someone who wasn't in the fandom before Chapter 2, its release shifted the nature of Ralsei discussions from is he Asriel to what the fuck is going on with this guy in general. And I'll admit that he does exhibit a lot of suspicious behavior, but I don't think his motives are as unknowable as they seem. For example, Ralsei specifically asks Chris to go retrieve items from the unused classroom on their own, leaving Susie unaware of Darkner's being objects. But it's not hard to see why Susie, in particular, would be upset to learn the truth, considering what a positive impact Dark Worlds have had on her so far. Still, I'm pretty sure the longer it's hidden from her, the more messy it'll be when she inevitably finds out. Anyways, if you talk to Ralsei or Susie before leaving to retrieve the objects, there's this really sweet interaction a lot of people miss where Ralsei asks if he was cuter with or without his hat. I feel like his tone is less people-pleasing here, and it's more like he's just teasing her, which is nice. The way he interacts with Susie feels increasingly more friendly and equal compared to how he talks to Chris/us. He's not afraid to get a little playfully mad at her. Susie's rebelliousness also becomes more healthy in this chapter. It no longer feels like she rebels because she doesn't care about anything, but because she does care. Her lack of knowledge about things like how the Dark World runs on video game mechanics or how her friend is possessed by an unknowable higher power enables her to point out things that are illogical and unfair, like when she reworks the battle system during the Sweet Cap'n Cakes fight so she and Ralsei can act independently of Chris, or drags Ralsei to hang out with her instead of letting us choose. She's still somewhat guarded, however, refusing to admit she's in pain when she injures herself and being a tsundere about her interest in healing magic. Despite previously insisting that only Chris should act on their own because it's their unique talent, Ralsei is eager to teach Susie healing, even though that's his thing and Susie is the tank of the party. It could be because Susie having healing spells benefits a pacifist playstyle more than her high attack does, or perhaps he's loosened up on maintaining rigid party roles. Alternatively, he just doesn't care about keeping his own special talent unique to him. Ralsei probably meant to teach Susie Heal Prayer, but she learned Ultimate Heal instead because she attacks with her magic. This is really interesting because Heal Prayer isn't unique to Ralsei. He shares it with Noelle, another character with ties to religion, and its description reads, "Heavenly Light restores a little HP to one party member." In contrast, Susie's Ultimate Heal is just said to heal one ally to the best of Susie's ability. He tried to teach her a generic spell, but she created something uniquely hers. For now, its uses are limited, but Toby Fox implied it might become more effective later on, and unlike Heal Prayer, it isn't dependent on Heavenly Light. So if, some catastrophe were to occur and Heavenly Light was no longer accessible, or Ralsei just wasn't in the party, it could prove to be very much necessary. On a related note, Devil's Knife increases Susie's magic and thus her healing, but Puppet Scarf decreases Ralsei's magic in favor of his attack, described as for those who abandon healing. Could Healer Susie and Tank Ralsei be a viable gameplay style in future chapters? I mean, I don't know why you would do that, but there's something in there about freedom and role reversal and defying the intended narrative or something. As a master of social intelligence, Susie also taught Ralsei sarcasm in return, so I wonder if she views sarcasm and being mean as a talent of hers, equivalent to healing being Ralsei's talent? Either way, she probably thought he needed to learn how to be a little mean, which is likely a step in the right direction for him. When Noelle assigns roles for the Mouse Puzzle Group project, she straight up doesn't give Ralsei one, so he and Susie just take turns jumping on the button. I mentioned earlier that a lot of people ignore Ralsei's existence, which becomes more obvious in Chapter 2. It's a running gag with Queen, and it's pretty clear why. He's a Darkner, she's focused on making Lightners happy, and he can't make a fountain for her. When it comes to Noelle and Birdly, though, things get weird. It's not like they can't see him at all or even necessarily forget he's there, they just aren't that curious about him. Noelle notices he looks familiar and then stops wondering about it. Birdly asks who Lancer is and later acknowledges him as Susie's friend, but brushes off Ralsei as just Chris's lackey. Ralsei asks Chris if this is true and will be happy with either answer because of course he is. As I said before, I think that Ralsei's forgettable presence is a result of him lacking an identity outside of fulfilling the prophecy and serving Lightners. So what does Queen do when she doesn't have a cage to capture him with? She throws him in a butler outfit, of course. And he's happy with this, thanking her for it later in what the game calls a slightly cringeworthy toast. This is also the only time he gets significant attention from other Darkners besides Lancer. Susie, on the other hand, is uncomfortable with Ralsei wearing it just as she's uncomfortable with his servant attitude in general, and makes him take it off. Additionally, in the Acid River sequence, Ralsei says he's come to appreciate Susie's individuality, and she's taught him that there's more to being a good friend than he thought, while also acknowledging how he doesn't really know who he is. This pattern is definitely setting up for Susie being a major component in Ralsei ditching the Lightner/player worship and finding his own personhood. But you'll notice that currently Susie's way of encouraging that is kind of ineffective. Her natural impulse is to just, well, tell him to stop doing things she finds weird or concerning.
Happy feet, dumbass!
She can support him, but she can't order him to become his own person and, well, stop taking orders. I think she may not have fully realized the extent of his issues so far and is only gradually becoming more aware of them. Not that Susie's stupid, but she's also not a Deltarune fan scrutinizing Ralsei's every action. Or writing a video essay. Ralsei did try to stop Lancer from jumping in Chris's pocket at the beginning of the chapter, but he waits until he turns to stone to explain how that stuff actually works. To be fair, he got cut off earlier, but not mentioning things until he absolutely must is something Ralsei does a lot, and it seems related to his tendency of avoiding negativity to an unnecessary degree, like in the post-Spamton Neo cutscene, for example. Susie notices the creepy meta undertones of that whole fight and feels like they shouldn't ignore it, but Ralsei dismisses it as random and meaningless, because acknowledging that Spamton was a person and what happened with him was significant would be disturbing and negative. If you choose no, Ralsei's solution is to encourage Chris to distract themselves with happy thoughts instead, which is iffy advice in this context, and Susie reluctantly agrees that what happened must have been meaningless after all, perhaps abandoning her suspicions to comfort them. Interestingly, if you have Chris lie and say yes, Susie and Ralsei actually put even more effort into comforting them. Ralsei says that if Chris doesn't want their friends to worry, then they should leave it be, which feels like projection. Just like how Ralsei tries to avoid making his friends worry about Spamton and many other things, he interprets Chris saying they're okay as them not wanting him and Susie to worry. Despite Ralsei presumably being more aware of Chris's situation, Susie does a much better job at consoling them because she's actually willing to confront problems. Okay, it's time to talk about the astral projection thing. Is he just doing it so he can talk to Chris, or is it for the player's sake, or is it to keep an eye on Susie? Why can you push him into skipping the cutscene in Chapter 2, but not Chapter 1? Is it just for speedrunners? Is Ralsei worried about us being homophobic and a speedrunner? I was going to go over a bunch of evidence that vaguely suggests Ralsei's motives behind these Susie cutaway scenes have more to do with, well, Susie than a lot of people think. But then I realized I was borrowing most of my points from my memories of this Tumblr post by Determinators, so I think it would be helpful to just summarize some of that and give credit where credit's due. First of all, Chris and Ralsei are likely viewing these scenes along with us, seeing as the soul is still connected to Chris during them and they even give input to Susie in Chapter 2. Ralsei's talk of how Susie's a real hero and he's so proud of her for saving them makes a bit more sense under the lens that he just saw her spare Lancer. When the cutscene is forcefully skipped in Snowgrave, Ralsei is surprised by them going off-script, so to speak, and wants to know what happened, but decided it's alright as long as Susie's happy. The post concludes that Ralsei wanted to prove a point about Susie's heroism in Chapter 1, but didn't necessarily need to do that again in Chapter 2 since the stakes were lower. This is a fairly plausible idea, especially because of that last point, but I think it may go beyond that. Deltarune has major themes of escapism, but as a work of fiction, it is escapism in itself. That is to say, it's a video game about video games, and a story about stories. One of its main meta-gimmicks is how it explores the relationship between a player and an unwilling quote-unquote blank slate protagonist. But what if this isn't where its deconstruction of protagonism ends? Susie also has many characteristics of a protagonist, not that of a video game in particular, but simply that of a story. She undergoes the most obvious development in Chapter 1 and is the one with the love interest. In fantasy stories, or really anything that vaguely follows a hero's journey format, the main character is often a normal person from the ordinary world who becomes an outsider when entering a new fantastical one. Susie fits this more than Chris, who is still the only human we know of in both worlds. Most notably, Susie is shown in the center during the Legend cutscene twice and has an unexplained crown motif in her bedroom. Perhaps Ralsei dedicates time to shifting to her point of view because she has a more particular or central role in the prophecy than we've been led to believe, in contrast to how she's also the most rebellious and anti-predestination. One of the most relevant things that Susie and Ralsei have somewhat opposing views on is the creation of more fountains. When Noelle mentions that her adventure in the Dark World wasn't so bad, Susie agrees, even calling the Dark World the better one. Thankfully, Birdley's dramatic monologue while charging his blade gives Ralsei enough time to scold everyone for almost starting the apocalypse. He didn't even realize they weren't aware of it, especially Queen, because he's so prophecy-minded he doesn't take into account that other people could be unaware or operating on different principles. I should probably mention that Ralsei didn't hide the roaring. It goes unnamed, but is very much present in the original Legend cutscene. This isn't to say he shouldn't have, brought it up more than once. They've been going on these fun adventures with the end goal of sealing the fountains without fully acknowledging why they need to do that, which is really weird. Susie doesn't reject Ralsei's warning, but she's also not entirely opposed to the creation of more fountains. At least at the beginning of Chapter 2, it's implied she feels like her friendship with Chris is dependent on the Dark World. Her desire to continue visiting them isn't just because she wants to skip homework, it's because she's only just discovered that it's possible for her to make friends and enjoy herself, but she associates that with the Dark World exclusively, not thinking those things are possible for her without it. She shakes Chris when she remembers that they just saved the world. She does believe in the roaring, and she recognizes herself as more of a hero than she did at the end of Chapter 1. What she doesn't recognize, however, is that Chris has committed mass theft in front of her and carried everything from the library into Castletown by themselves, somehow. Her talk of having Lancer and Ralsei go to school with them, while very cute, is a reminder that she will inevitably have to learn the truth about why that's not possible. In terms of the lore, there's a large gap in knowledge between Ralsei and Susie. Ralsei knows a lot about Dark Worlds, but only explains things when he feels it's needed. Susie doesn't really know anything about anything, but she does have the perspective to question things. She's like the straight man of Deltarune, not in a comedy sense or a heterosexual sense, but in a cosmic horror sense. She doesn't appear to have anything crazy going on with her behind the scenes like Chris and Ralsei do. She's fairly guarded, but still a pretty honest character in comparison. If it wasn't obvious at this point, the nature of these opposing roles is that even if they're able to get along right now, there's bound to be serious conflict between these two at some point, perhaps as early as Chapter 3. Many things are being somewhat deliberately hidden from Susie by Ralsei, like the nature of Dark Worlds, and especially Chris's possession. This, coupled with the fact that they have different views on fountains and Chris just made one, is a recipe for disaster. It's a common prediction that Ralsei will become an antagonist at some point, and I find this pretty likely, not because he's evil and will have a heel turn revealing his ulterior motives, but because Susie and Chris's motives will change as they learn more about the legend and such, and the differences in opinion between them and Ralsei become more apparent. That isn't to say Susie is guaranteed to always stay on Chris's side, though. I imagine the revelation that Chris is under our control will throw a wrench in their friendship as well. Noelle could easily play a part in this conflict as well. She shares Susie's opinions on the fountains, and on top of that, is heavily tied to the angel, whose heaven is supposed to be banished according to the prophecy. While I'm skeptical that she could just replace Ralsei, seeing as gameplay-wise she's meant to substitute for him and Susie at the same time, and I don't think we'll have a choice in the matter, I'll say there is some decent potential foreshadowing for him leaving the party at least, and maybe Noelle taking his place for a while. Regardless, I'm pretty confident we'll see the party split in some way for some period of time due to the aforementioned conflicts. For example, although I talked about Susie potentially being the central character of the prophecy, if any role in the legend is replaceable, it's hers. There's only one Prince of the Dark and only one human in Hometown, but there are lots of monsters. This all doesn't look very good for Susie and Ralsei's friendship, so I want to repeat that despite everything, they've influenced each other quite positively so far. Deltarune's darker tone compared to Undertale makes a lot of people suspect that its apparent one ending will be more of a downer. But I don't know, I think the theme of friendship remains as strong here as in the previous game, and that makes me hopeful that, even if the roaring happens or all the dark fountains are closed or whatever, these two will at least resolve things on a good note. Thank you for watching. I do have plans for more videos I want to make, including some Deltarune stuff, so I hope you'll stick around for that. Despite its flaws, I learned a lot from making this video, so I hope that my future stuff can be improved. And also shorter, I worked on this script on and off since August, so any online validation you could spare would be much appreciated.